Welcome to this edition of Grain Farmers of Ontario GrainTALK Webinar titled Management Strategies and Innovative Research on Corn Rootworm. I'm Laura Ferrier with Grain Farmers of Ontario, and joining me today, also from GFO, are Marty Vermey and Paul Barnard. Our special guest today is current master's student Tuesday Kristianson. Some general housekeeping to note is that CCA CEU credits have been applied for this webinar. Please stay tuned on how to apply for them. Before Tuesday shares her presentation with us today, Paul is going to take a moment to share some information on the Grain Farmers of Ontario Research Department as it ties in deeply to today's presentation.
Thanks, Laura. GFO annually provides $1.85 million in funding to support research that will help advance and support Ontario's grain industry. This funding is used to support research in 4 specific areas, namely agronomy and production, weed, disease, and insect pests, crop quality and utilization, and finally breeding and genetics. Each year, GFO seeks to fund new research projects that support at least one of these priorities. GFO achieves this by annually inviting researchers to submit new research proposals. New proposals are received and reviewed by GFO's research committee, who evaluate each one before deciding which proposals to fund. As the research coordinator here at GFO, one of my areas of responsibility is to oversee this process, which begins in June of each year and wraps up the following January. The research project that you will shortly hear about is one of many projects that GFO has funded since the organization was formed in 2010. This particular project, focusing on corn rootworm, is being led by Dr. Jocelyn Smith, who is a professor at the University of Guelph, based at the Ridgetown campus. If you'd like to know more about the research projects GFO has funded, please check out our online database of research proposals at gfo.ca/research. That's all for me. I'll turn this back to Laura. Thanks, Laura.
Thanks, Paul, for sharing that overview of the department and how Grain Farmers of Ontario contributes to field crop research in Ontario. It's a really valuable portion of our organization, and we're so happy to be able to share some of the research coming out of it. So next, I'd like to introduce Tuesday. Tuesday is joining us for this particular webinar, and we are very thankful for her joining us. Tuesday grew up in a rural community and initially thought that her path would lead down the animal science route until working as a summer student in the biostimulant business with Legacy Monsanto. She completed her bachelor's degree in honors agriculture in 2020 and entered the industry focused on the seed business with Corteva Agriscience, where she earned her CCA designation. Opportunities to participate in agronomy research projects in her current role are what led her to an interest in grad school. The impact of Jocelyn Smith's research was having on insect management in Ontario drew her to the program, where she was provided an incredible opportunity to work on a potential biological strategy to manage an insect that has continued to combat the tools that are thrown at it. As Tuesday completes her grad work in Smith's lab, she also recently stepped into the role of Biological Innovations Manager in Ontario for Corteva Agriscience. Her first and foremost goal is to always have the farmer's success in mind when working with new tools and strategies to manage the challenges faced in agriculture. Tuesday, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you so much. I first wanted to thank GFO for including me in their GrainTALK webinar series today. I'm really looking forward to sharing some of the research that we're conducting in terms of corn rootworm management out of Dr. Jocelyn Smith's lab at the University of Guelph. So today I'm really going to be focusing on my research, looking at a potential new biological control method for corn rootworm management, as well as an overview of managing corn rootworm, the current tools that we have access to, and then a brief update on some of the resistance scenarios that we've had occur in Ontario recently. My work is I work really closely with Dr. Jocelyn Smith and Dr. Dave Hooker out of the University of Guelph, as well as my extended committee and the many resources at the University of Guelph Ridgetown campus. So when we begin talking about insects, we always like to start with the insect's life cycle. It's very, very crucial to understand the life cycle in order to understand how to manage it and the different tools that are available to manage it. And so when we're referring to corn rootworm specifically, corn rootworm is an insect that occurs in 1 generation per year. So from the adult life stage until from the egg life stage until the adult life stage, that only occurs once a year. There isn't multiple generations throughout the year, unlike some other insects we manage in Ontario. And the eggs are the life stage that overwinter. And so those eggs will get laid in the fall by those adult beetles. Those eggs will overwinter in the soil, and the eggs typically hatch, we usually say the first week of June in Ontario. Very heat unit dependent, obviously. This year, we definitely saw rootworm larval pressure earlier in the season, just with all the rootworm or the heat units we had earlier in the season. But usually it's around that first week of June. And so those rootworm larvae will hatch and feed on that nodal root system of the corn plant. So that's when the majority of the damage occurs, and I'll touch on that in the next slide. The majority of damage occurs in that life stage. They'll feed on that root system for about 4 to 6 weeks, and then they'll pupate in the soil before they emerge as an adult beetle. And so the reason I have two different beetle images on the slide here is because we do have two predominant species of corn rootworm in Ontario. On the left-hand side, the yellow and black beetle, that's our western corn rootworm. And to the right, that green beetle is our northern corn rootworm. And so typically we'll see more western corn rootworms in southwestern Ontario, especially down in southern Ontario. And we'll typically start to see northern corn rootworms as we move into eastern Ontario and Quebec. But there definitely are pockets of each of them throughout that geography. And so those beetles will mate within their subspecies and then lay their eggs. And then those eggs will overwinter to the following year, and where they'll hatch in the following year. And so corn rootworm is a primary pest in corn. And so rootworm beetles prefer to lay their eggs in corn, and those rootworm larvae stage prefer to feed on corn. So obviously there's some caveats to that, but for the most part in Ontario, that's what we've seen. And so you can imagine if that's their primary source of food and the primary area where they like to lay their eggs, a continuous corn system is what causes their population to thrive, versus kind of planting a non-host crop like soybeans in that system the following year. And one of the other instances that can cause a rootworm population to thrive is finer textured soils. So rootworm beetles enjoy laying their eggs in a moist soil, which is typically finer textured soils in that fall period. And rootworm eggs, a coarser textured soil can be quite abrasive to rootworm eggs as well. And so typically we'll see higher populations of rootworms in those areas that have continuous corn, as well as finer textured soils. Those are kind of two segments that can correlate. And so what does rootworm injury look like, and what are some of the symptoms that that can occur, result in yield loss? The first being that root injury. So that larval feeding is the most detrimental to not only yield, but also in terms of harvestability of the crop. Those are kind of the two main reasons why we manage this pest. Rootworm injury, like I said, can occur from 4 to 6 weeks during that larval feeding period. And those rootworm larvae will go through 3 molting periods. And as they get bigger, they target larger roots. So they'll begin feeding on the fibrous roots early on in the season and then target those nodal roots. That result in the highest amount of damage, a decrease in nutrient uptake, and just a reduction in that root system as well. And so typically we're not getting calls from someone because they've noticed root injury. We're getting calls because they've noticed symptomology that's resulted in that. And so one of the most common symptoms and causes for concern for potential root damage and corn rootworm pressure is goosenecking. And so what occurs is the plant obviously has a reduction in its root mass. And so either due to a wind event or due to a small root system, the corn crop will begin to lean, and then we'll try and overcompensate for that and result in that goosenecking symptomology in the field. That being said, goosenecking isn't always caused by rootworm damage. The easiest way to determine if it is a rootworm concern is just to dig the plant up and look at potential feeding symptoms. There aren't many other factors in the soil that would contribute to that extensive amount of feeding. So it's usually a cause for concern with rootworm presence if that's what you're seeing when you dig up the plant. And secondary injury can occur from the adults. So this is where the least amount of concern would come from a rootworm population, but can still result in pollination issues. So if the kind of peak flight for adult emergence occurs closely to prime pollination timeframe, we can see a reduction in kernels. Potentially, this hasn't been a major concern in Ontario in previous years. Typically, brown silk has occurred by the time that rootworm adult presence is at its peak, but in really heavy rootworm pressure years or in fields that have heavy rootworm pressure, it can be a cause for concern. And so based on previous research, there isn't a strong correlation between yield and rootworm damage, but previous research would indicate that per node on the root system, so if we're looking at the root system per node fed on, we could see a potentially 15% yield loss. And this can differ depending on what environmental conditions are like throughout the rest of the growing season as well. So this is just a map that I like to show that overlays, I indicated that continuous corn acres can cause the most amount of rootworm pressure if you're not using a management tactic. And so this is just a map that overlays continuous corn acres in Ontario from 2011 to 2023. And so if we look at those purple red areas, that's where we see the most amount of continuous corn. It can correlate to soil texture, it can correlate to livestock production as well, production systems that require a lot of corn to feed livestock. And one thing I like to point out, I did mention that finer textured soils can favor a higher rootworm population as well. When we look at sandier soils, although there might be a lot of continuous corn on sandier soils because of that soil texture preference, we might not see those higher levels of rootworm populations and might not be as concerned about the insect as you might in a finer textured soil production system. And before I get into management tactics, I also like to point out corn rootworm pressure can change year over year as well. So this was looking at, if you look at the axis to the left, we score when we're indicating rootworm injury in a corn plant, we score it, the rootworm root mass on a 0 to 3 scale. And so a higher number, the closer to 3, the more injury the more injury there's been done by rootworm larvae. And obviously the closer to 0, the less amount of injury. And so this is just coming out of some of my research plots. In 2022, we had significant pressure. And as we move through 2023 and 2024, you can see different levels of rootworm pressure. So we don't have an exact reason why that is, but we do know that rootworm pressure can differ year over year depending on the environment as well, specifically the environment at egg hatching. So one of the inferences we've made for a lower rootworm pressure in 2024 is that we were quite wet during rootworm hatching this year. So did that have an impact on larvae survival? This field specifically was also planted on the later side as well. So was there a large enough root system when those rootworm emerged to provide a good feeding source for them too? So I just like to indicate this. Tracy Bowdy's done a lot of work on corn rootworm trapping too. And a lot of her rootworm adult beetle populations would correlate very similarly to what we're seeing here in terms of rootworm injury. So when we talk about management tactics in Ontario, there's kind of 4 main tactics that we refer to traditionally. The first being crop rotation. So like I said earlier, continuous corn systems, they thrive in. And so if we rotate to a non-host crop, in the following year, you can really halt that life cycle. One thing I like to point out here too is you want to make sure a non-host crop is in production for the entire rootworm life cycle. And so we often get questions regarding would a cover crop over the winter impede that life cycle at all? And the answer would be no. You want to make sure that there's a non-host crop in that field through the entire that entire feeding period. And so crop rotation is the #1 way to manage your rootworm populations because they like laying their eggs in corn too. If you plant corn and then plant soybeans or sugar beets or alfalfa and non-host crop the following year, they wouldn't be able to feed on those crops either. And so that's why we don't worry about first year corn often, is because if you have a soybean crop in production the year before, you wouldn't expect at least in our scenario in Ontario, that they would lay their eggs in that crop. The second being monitoring populations. And so when we talk about monitoring populations, we utilize these yellow sticky traps. And so these traps aren't utilized to make a decision on this year's production, on what to do this year, but more if you need to implement a tactic in the following year. So we aren't using them as an indication for spraying in the year in question, but more so on what we can do if we need another tactic to monitor going into our second year or the following year. Thirdly, insecticides. So currently in Ontario, we don't have any seed treatments available that are registered for corn rootworm larvae. We also don't have any foliar insecticides for beetles either. So we don't have anything registered in Ontario. They are utilized in certain areas of the US where they have really significant pressure. But one note to make on the foliars is that rootworm adult emergence period is really wide. And so a lot of the insecticides that you would be using, that you would throw in kind of at that adult emergence period, don't have a lot of residual either. And so it hasn't really been seen as a strong management tactic for managing those rootworm beetles for that year or the following year. And we also don't have any registered in Ontario. But we do have a few granular or liquid soil applied insecticides available that can be utilized for larvae. These were actually traditionally utilized before we had BT corn, which I'm going to move on to next. Prior to 2003, there were a lot of granular insecticide boxes on planters for producers that were growing continuous corn to manage that insect. But since the induction of BT corn, there's been a lot of that we've moved away from. There has been more utilized in recent years with some of the resistance concerns that we're running into as well. But it is a tactic if you have capabilities on your planter to utilize. And lastly, in terms of management tactics, the primary utilized tactic would be transgenic corn or BT corn. And so transgenic corn are hybrids that produce genes that code for the production of an insecticidal toxin. So in this case, we're utilizing Bacillus thuringiensis. So it codes for the production of insecticidal toxins. And we'll note that we also use BT corn when we're managing other insects, like European corn borer or Western bean cutworm. They are different toxins. So when you're looking at planting a hybrid that has protection against corn rootworm, you'll want to make sure you're specifically looking for hybrids that contain those specific traits, and not just ones that contain them for lepidopteran or moth insects that we also manage. So they were first introduced in 2003. And they contain one single protein. And so now the hybrids we're using contain, they're pyramided, we would say. So they contain multiple proteins to ensure we have multiple proteins to utilize for resistance, for protection against resistance development. It's one tactic we use to protect against resistance development. But in the last few years, even in the US, I believe it was 2011 when the US had its first concern for resistance development against some of these BT proteins we were using. And in recent years in Ontario, we've began to have some of the same concerns in all of our commercially available corn hybrids. And so I'll kind of delve into that a little bit more in this slide. So the way I like to think about BT corn and transgenic corn, and when we look at these BT proteins on the left-hand side, is very similar to when we talk about modes of action and chemicals that we use for weed control. And so there are what we would say two modes of action in these BT corn packages, but they are really similar modes of action. So different when we talk about weed control. They're very similar modes of action, and although the BT protein might differ based on the different trait package, they're quite similar that rotating to a different trait package isn't a way to prevent resistance development. Planting the same different trait packages would be exposing the insect to very similar forms of those BT proteins. And so due to overuse in some cases, due to the need to utilize them in a lot of these systems, and due to rootworms' ability to adapt, they don't move very far when they reproduce either. And so it's similar populations constantly being exposed. It's not like Western bean cutworm that can move hundreds of kilometers throughout a season. They're really in their own zone, maybe moving a couple kilometers in a season, but for the most part, they're mating and laying their eggs where they emerge. And so that just creates more obstacles when we throw tactics like this at them as well. And so as we move into Ontario, and when we talk about resistance, luckily we do have a new mode of action from a genetic perspective on the market. So RNAi has just been launched in Ontario. So it provides two BT protein options for rootworm management, but also a differentiated mode of action in that DVSNF7 trait, or RNAi, as we refer to it. So it is a differentiated mode of action. It does provide protection against rootworm in those scenarios where we're starting to see resistance, but it also isn't a saving grace. It's not a silver bullet either. And we want to make sure that we're protecting the longevity of this trait. It is going to be really important in terms of managing rootworm in Ontario, but we want to make sure that we're doing all we can to protect the longevity. And that would include rotating where we can. If we can ensure that we only have 1, 2, or 3 years corn in the system versus 15 years corn, we're just ensuring that we can protect the longevity of these traits moving forward. It is going to be really, really important in terms of rootworm management, even in areas where we don't have resistance. Adding an additional mode of action to that trait package allows us to improve the longevity of those BT proteins in areas where we aren't seeing concern either. And so with that, how do we continue to combat resistance as well? How do we continue to combat resistance in this system to protect the traits that we do have on the market? Because they are still going to be the most primary source of protection against rootworm. And so that's where my research really comes in terms of, can we utilize a biological control method to protect against corn rootworm and to protect against resistance development in these traits? And so where my research really comes into play is utilizing entomopathogenic nematodes. So what is an entomopathogenic nematode? It's a microscopic roundworm that parasitizes its host. So in the bottom right corner, you can see what under a microscope these nematodes look like. And so what they do is they enter openings in their host's body. So they do have a wide host range as well, not just corn rootworm. They enter their host body, they release a symbiotic bacteria that then kills the host, and they'll continue to reproduce in their host until the cadaver is no longer viable, and then they'll move away and find another host to reproduce within. And so historically, they've been used as a short-term biopesticide in cropping systems with limited chemical options. So specifically greenhouses, they've been a main utilization method in greenhouses. And those greenhouses have been using very high rates of these nematodes, or EPNs, as we refer to them as well. But one of the challenges with the ones that we use in a greenhouse versus what we want to use in the field is the greenhouse nematodes are really what we would use in greenhouses are really susceptible to temperature changes and moisture changes. So if they were to be introduced in our field production systems, their survivability would be quite low. And so a number of years ago, Dr. Elson Shields out of Cornell University was doing some work looking at utilizing a persistent source of these nematodes. So if we were to make these species, the same species we utilize in horticulture production, more persistent as a long-term protection method in field production systems, what would that mean for insect management? Not just for corn rootworm, but in general. And so what they have developed are these persistent sources of these nematodes, and they're doing that by rearing them in a soil environment outdoors, and then rearing them in the lab for a couple generations, and then introducing them back into the soil. And this just keeps those durability features viable within those species. And so he was doing some work with alfalfa snout beetle, which is another concerning below ground insect. And in that, some of those fields were getting rotated to corn, and that's when we determined that there could be some efficacy potential on managing corn rootworm. And so that's what my research is really looking at. We're utilizing 3 species of nematodes in different solutions. The main species are kind of down here in the left-hand corner. And this just indicates this is a waxworm larvae. And what I wanted to show you here is that depending on what nematode species that waxworm is inoculated with will change the color. And a lot of that has to do with the symbiotic bacteria that these different species produce. So what was my research really focusing on? So we sourced these nematodes from Persistent Biocontrol, which is a business that's now developed out of Dr. Elson Shields' research, using these persistent nematodes. And we're using 3 different species of nematodes. The reason why we're using 3 different species is because they all exist at different soil layers. And so we want to be able to target rootworm populations in different layers of the soil, depending on where they're going to be emerging from, depending on what area of the root zone they're feeding on. So previous research had determined that using different species increased your efficacy. And because these species are persistent, we only need to apply them in the first year of study. And so part of this study is you apply them in the first year, and year over year, populations increase to a level that would increase the efficacy on corn rootworm management. So we applied them at the V2 corn growth stage in 2022, so in the first year of study in this field. And the reason we targeted that stage was because that's somewhat in line with corn rootworm emergence. So we wanted to make sure they had a feeding source at the time of application. And we wanted to ensure the soil was moist at the time of application as well to improve their initial inoculation. So what are we seeing? So this is based on research from 2022 to 2024. And so based on previous research out of Cornell University, they found that you can expect some reduction in corn rootworm feeding with these nematodes in year 1, but you're going to receive the majority kind of in those later years once those populations have built up. So this is just showing a combination of my my data from 2022 to this year. So as you'll see on the left-hand side, like I explained in my earlier rootworm population data, this is the node injury. So this is what we assess when we're looking at corn rootworm. We're assessing those roots on a 0 to 3 scale based on injury. And then the different colors indicate whether it was treated or what nematode species it was treated with. So blue being untreated, and then orange and green being the different solutions. And then I also separated out by hybrids that had BT protection for corn rootworm, and then hybrids that hybrids that had on the right-hand side, and then hybrids that didn't have protection on the left-hand side. So my plots contained all commercially available BT trait packages as well as their partnered non-BT option. And so one of the biggest things that we're seeing out of this is that, for one, if you look at the BT protected, we're not seeing any significant damage from those corn rootworms. So when we're talking about corn rootworms threshold for concern, a score of 0.5 or higher is what would be indicated of a concern. So because we're below that threshold on the right-hand side, there's not a lot of indication that we have any resistance concerns in this study. Based on this alone, not based on obviously lab studies with that population. But then on the left-hand side, what is really interesting to me is that based on not having any BT protection against corn rootworm, we're seeing, compared from the untreated to our solution with Heterohepatitis bacteriophora and Steinernema feltiae, nematodes, we're seeing a 21% reduction, and this is a 21% significant reduction in node injury. So that's really interesting to me as an early indication of what this could mean for rootworm populations in the soil in a combined data set. As I said before, we wouldn't want to be using this as our only mode of action either. We want to make sure we're using it in conjunction with our commercially available traits. But since we have no concern for resistance in this field, it was really interesting to me that we're seeing that reduction in node injury in hybrids that don't have protection early data. So, and in terms of a sustainable corn rootworm management scenario, this biological control method is of great interest to our production system, what it could mean for managing corn, not only corn rootworm, but other insects, soil-borne insects. And so we always like to, when we're discussing corn rootworm management, is always come back to what's the sustainable way to manage corn rootworm populations with the modes of action that we have. And so if we think about kind of a 4-year cycle, the first year being first year corn, so we wouldn't expect there to be any existing corn rootworm population in that field if a non-host crop was planted the year before. So we don't need to be using a management tactic in that first year. With the second year, if we're monitoring populations in that first year, based on those sticky traps that I indicated, and we're not above threshold, either 1 Western corn rootworm or 2 Northern corn rootworms, going into the second year, considering if we need a tactic, a management tactic, and if we do need a management tactic, either picking BT corn or a soil applied insecticide. And then as we move into third year corn, implementing a different mode of action, whether it's BT corn or a soil applied insecticide. So where I really see nematode utilizing EPNs in this system being really impactful is, could it allow us to get 1 more year into the system without having to implement either BT or a soil applied insecticide? So managing those populations on its own initially, and then introducing a chemical control option in year 3, with the hope that we would rotate out of corn in year 4. But I'm really excited for the opportunity that this biological control method is going to provide for Ontario corn producers in conjunction with what we're already doing in order to continue to sustainably manage corn rootworm. So I just wanted to thank all of and acknowledge my advisors, Dr. David Hooker and Dr. Jocelyn Smith, as well as the rest of my advisory committee, the laboratory support I've received at the University of Guelph, as well as the technical support, and then as well my funding partners. With special thank you to GFO for all the commitment they've made to corn rootworm research and insect management in Ontario. And I'd be happy to take any questions.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Tuesday. It's always really interesting to hear about the life cycle, the BMPs when managing this particular pest, and then the incredible research that you are working on. As myself, as a farmer and an agronomist, I'm always very keen to learn what new technology is being worked on, and that might help growers with various issues that are being identified. And of course, it's always great to hear that crop rotation is an amazing way to manage these pests, rotating into a non-host crop, and then also what you've shared, some options to sustainably manage corn rootworm populations at various stages through that production system. So thanks so much for sharing that with us. I don't know if Marty or Paul have any questions.
Yeah,
I had
thanks,
Marty
Tuesday.
Jump in there.
Yeah, thanks, Tuesday. Great presentation. Do have a few questions for you just on corn rootworm. Some of our people that are watching or listening may be kind of curious about corn rootworm a little bit more. And as your presentation was going, I was kind of thinking of these same kind of questions. So I'm just wondering about the insect pressure level across the field for corn rootworm. Do you find that it's very uniform, or are there certain pockets that show up? Just wondered your thoughts, if you've seen anything or working with the other researchers. Has there been anything identified as far as locations in field or environments that are more susceptible to corn rootworm?
Great question, Marty. And the answer, I'm going to answer partly on my experience as well. And I would definitely say yes. It's not very uniform across the field. It is quite variable across the field. Depending on the field, some of that could be soil texture as well. Finer areas of the soil where there's more of a moist environment when those adults are laying eggs as well. Some scenarios where you're probably not going to see as much pressure on a sand knoll versus a muckier part of the field potentially. I find too, planting date, I did have it written in my slides, but planting date can sometimes impact that. So if you have continuous corn in a field and there was variable pollination across the field the year before, rootworms will be attracted to where they can feed as well. So the more where those fresh silks are present could be a potential for higher like egg laying rates in those areas of the field. So that could potentially have an impact, as well as probably other environmental, maybe field edges are going to be more impacted potentially depending on where those rootworms came from. But in answer to your question, that's just based on my experience. I would say it can be quite variable across the field.
Yeah, so you can't just drive by the road and see some lodged corn and think you have it, or drive by and see standing corn and say, I don't have it, I don't have any resistance issues. But once you get combining, you may see pockets in the field that are root lodged more than others. And that's a reason for concern for farmers to investigate and see if they have
Absolutely.
resistance. Yeah, no,
Absolutely.
yeah. Another thing probably with nematodes, probably I get questions about too. It's like you're putting a biological control, an insect in the field. Is there any risk to having that insect in there? I'm just thinking if you're growing root crops or anything like that, can that nematode go to different crops and cause damage to those crops?
Yeah, thank you for that question. We definitely do get that quite a bit. And so when we're talking about entomopathogenic nematodes, we're talking about a beneficial nematode specifically. So these beneficials, they survive in it's a non-plant host. So we're not concerned about them causing concern like soybean cyst nematode would that survives, that's a plant parasitic nematode. These hosts are non-plant specific. So you wouldn't have any concern of applying them to the field and then them causing damage in a non-corn crop because their hosts are not plant hosts.
Excellent. Thanks.
On that
go-
survivability Tuesday, and maybe this is future research that needs to be worked on, but do these nematodes, will they survive in -30 temperatures, or is it something that I'm sure your research was in Ridgetown, or did you look at other areas that might experience slightly colder winters than maybe that Ridgetown area?
Yeah, so the primary of my research took place in Ridgetown. We did have some like field trials as well, working with other seed companies, working with farmers that were interested in utilizing this on their own operation due to resistance concerns. So we do, in my research, we are taking soil samples every single year to determine the presence of these nematodes in the soil. Now, the test that we do for these nematodes, it's not like we can just count the number of eggs or count the number of adults. We are infesting them. We are infesting them with another host, and then based on the presence of those nematodes in that host, we'll determine the frequency of nematodes in the soil. So it's quite a subjective test. There definitely is a lot of research and development going into how we can better test these beneficials in the soil in order to have accurate understanding of their long-term persistence. But based on research conducted out of New York State, they've been finding these same species after application like a decade later. So we're working on that in Ontario slowly. We don't have a built data set on that by any means, but we are looking at the goal of the persistency of these nematodes is that they can withstand the test of negative temperatures and high temperatures and different crops as well. If you were not planting corn anymore, we want to make sure the population's still going to withstand in a soybean crop or another non-crop. So
That's amazing. Thank you. Marty, I think you maybe had someone.
Yeah, Tuesday, your comments regarding the mobility of the insect is so critical as far as us thinking about resistance. And a lot of people think, oh, resistance came from somewhere else, it flew from somewhere else. But your comment about they're very, very localized. And actually the resistance that we have in the province is really based on homegrown resistance and just the use of the technology. So your presentation really hit home, and it's really good for us in Ontario to understand resistance and how to manage resistance. So I really appreciate the time you took today to talk about your research work and a lot more of the information about the insect. And the last thing I would say that if there are any farmers that have or notice resistance, have any root lodging, probably the recommendation, I'll just say that probably Tracy Bowdy would be a great contact in Ontario if you do notice any resistance. I don't know, Tuesday, if you have any other recommendations that farmers should take if they see any resistance or issues like, as you mentioned, basically the root lodging issues that they see.
Absolutely. Tracy Bowdy is an excellent resource. I'm contacting the University of Guelph lab directly. I have Jocelyn's contact here as well, or your seed provider. So a lot of these seed providers, they're trait providers as well. And so they have, they kind of work closely with OMAFRA and the University of Guelph to manage what we would classify as an unexpected damage concern too. So any of those three options is great if you have concerns.
Amazing. That is great. Thanks so much, Tuesday, again, for taking the time to share this with us and your research and some BMPs and everything we need to know to go forward and hopefully manage our corn rootworm populations a little bit better as we move forward. So for those of you who have watched this webinar for CCA CEU credits, please contact me at lferrier@gfo.ca to claim the credit for this learning opportunity. But with that, we will sign off and thank you so much, Tuesday.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.